Mm. Good evening. What? Tell me, John, you're saying you got something on your mind. Aloha. Hey, I'm just trying to support your new snow cone shack that you just bought. John Snow Cone Shack. John Snow Cones. Huh? It's right down there across from the Third and Main right there. He bought the Snow Cone Shack down there. Him and Teresa. But I heard they were going to make it like a pulled pork shack or something. So it's all Teresa's deal. Got it. Well, good. It's good to see y'all tonight, Bobby. Thanks for that. Very true. Um, very true. A lot of good words there, brother. Uh, we started talking about this and Saul and kind of Saul's downfall last time, and I'm not going anywhere. I think that we. I think in the Old Testament, me and Buck was kind of talking, and he says, it gets kind of confusing, and we get kind of lost. And I need to try to do something to help with that. And I don't know that me telling you would be the best thing. Maybe I need to try to write it down a little bit. But basically, if you start with the Old Testament, what's the first 5 books of the Old Testament? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, right? And you know what we call that? We call that the Pentateuch, right? The Pentateuch, or the law, right? First 5 books. And we say that, and we give Moses credit for that, writing the first 5 books of the Bible. And probably the fascinating thing to me about it, when I look at that first 5 books, is I think about the written language. We take it for granted, don't we? There's languages all over the world, and those languages are written, and we understand them, and we translate them, and we talk about them, but have you ever thought how ancient the Bible is? It's almost before written language. If you look at Genesis, it is before written language, right? The Bible is ancient, and those words are ancient, and especially when you look at the first 5 books of the Bible, they're that's really ancient text. It's almost hard to wrap my head around it, The idea of it is hard to wrap my head around. But when you get through those first 5 books, right? What happens in that, That's the history of man as far as God wants us to know it, up till they come out of Egypt, right? To the mountain, right? The mountain's the big dividing point, isn't it? The mountain, right? That's, we call it the 3 dispensations when we talk about the Bible. Talk about the patriarchal age, which is up to the mountain. Then the Mosaic age, which is from the law of Moses to Christ, and then the Christian age. That's how we divide it up. 3 ages: patriarchal, Mosaic, Christian. So once they wander and God finally says, well, you can cross over the Jordan, right? Then who actually takes them over the Jordan? Joshua, right? Joshua, the son of Nun, right? Joshua and Caleb were the 2 guys who said they could go. Everybody else said you can't win. So God spared them, right? All the other fighting age men died in the wilderness, 40 years. All the fighting age males died in the wilderness, except for Joshua and Caleb. Everybody else would die. So that's pretty astounding. So then they cross over the Jordan, and Joshua, he he defeats all these nations and gives them their land inheritance. But when Joshua dies, then who leads Israel? When Joshua dies. Because Moses takes them out, right? And Moses is kind of the leader of the bunch, right? And then Moses dies, and he gives it to Joshua. Joshua takes them over the Jordan, and Joshua defeats all these nations, right? And then Joshua dies, and then who takes over? Who leads Israel then? After Joshua dies? Judges. Right, So there really isn't a leader. There really isn't. There's not a king. There's not a governor, as we would know it, or a leader, They're a nation with no leader, basically, which is how God intended for it to be. Because God intended for it to be led by God, intended for it to be led from the temple, not from man, right? God intended to be their leader. It was kind of this simple formula, right? You do what I say, and I'm going to be your God, and I'm going to take care of you. Pretty simple. But, of course, they didn't, right? So that's what gets us to Samuel. And Samuel's unique because Samuel is a judge, but Samuel's a judge that kind of rules over all of Israel, not just a piece. Most judges didn't do that. Most judges just had a little bitty spot. Like Samson didn't rule over all. Samson really didn't do much of nothing. You get right down to it. Samson was kind of a wash. But there were a few other judges, Deborah, Barak, Jephthah. There were other judges. But they never ruled over Israel as a nation. They were raised up specifically for a purpose. Like when Gideon was called. Remember that? Gideon was raised up to fight the Midianites. That's what he did. And after a judge would fulfill their purpose, they would no longer be a judge. So some judges were only judges for a few weeks. Some judges were judges for several years. But none of them judged all of Israel. See? So Samuel's very unique because Samuel, as we looked at, was raised up by Eli the priest, right? And Samuel had a priesthood. So Samuel was a priest. He was able to do sacrifice. He was able to be a priest over Israel. But Samuel was also a judge over Israel. Samuel was also a prophet, a seer. So Samuel had, because God taught to Samuel, right? And God didn't always do that with people. So Samuel was very unique in history, in the history of the Bible. There's some people in the history of the Bible that are extremely unique. And Samuel was one of those individuals. He was an extremely unique person under God. He was a Levite from birth, right? We talked about that. There were only 3 people in the Bible that were Levites from birth. Samson, and Samuel, and John the Baptist. Those are the only people in the Bible that were ever Levites from birth. A razor never touched their head their entire life. Well, except Samson, and we know how that worked out. But those guys were Levites, and that's what Samuel was. So Samuel was very unique. He was a Levite from birth. Razor never touched his head. He was a judge of Israel. He was a priest over Israel. He was a prophet over Israel. Very unique in the Bible. There's no more Samuel. Samuel was one of a kind. He's kind of like John the Baptist. Samuel was one of a kind. And when Samuel gets old, which is where Samuel's at now, and we've seen Saul last time, Saul made this great blunder, right? Saul made this tremendous blunder with this sacrifice, and Samuel and the Lord said, I'm going to take this kingdom away from you. I'm going to take it out of your hand. You're not going to be king anymore. But God's not going to do it in a day or 2 days or a week or a month or years. It's going to be years before David is actually going to take the throne. Even after David's anointed, which we'll see that to be king, David's still not going to take the throne. But it's a unique time in the history of Israel. It's the only time under the kings, especially David and Solomon, where Israel really has relative peace, and they're really a nation, and they really have a leader, and the world's kind of good. It's kind of good. It's what when the people of Jesus said we want to go back to how we were, they meant under the days of Solomon. That's what they meant. They wanted to go back to that, back to David, back to Solomon, back to this united kingdom when it was all one. But that's not going to last because God's going to make that go away. After Solomon, the kingdom's divided, Jeroboam and Rehoboam. That's when the kingdom divides. It comes the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So when you go through the Old Testament, it goes pretty chronological for a while. First, but when you start, so you go to Samuel, we're to Saul now, right? We're to Saul, and we're going to go to David. And when you get to David and Solomon, that's where 1st, 2nd Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles kick off. But the unique thing about Chronicles and Kings is that you see what happens is when the kingdom divides under Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and you get the northern kingdom, which is the 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom, which is Judah and Benjamin. You have these two kingdoms that exist, okay? And the reason they call that the northern kingdom is because it's north of Judah. Judah's about as far south as you get. Judah's down by where the Dead Sea is. The northern kingdom goes up from there, across the Jordan, all the way up through the Sea of Galilee, all the way up, in Jesus' day, what'll be Samaria, and all that, Samaria, Galilee, all that would be that northern kingdom. But what happens is, in 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles is the kingdom divides. And because of that, you have two different kingly lineages, okay? You have a kingly line that's the northern kingdom kings. And if you think about them, probably the one probably would come to your mind. If you think of one, if you really think, would probably be Ahab and Jezebel. Those were northern. He was a northern kingdom king. Jezebel was northern kingdom. So you have two lineages. You have a kingdom, you have northern kingdom kings, and then you have southern kingdom kings, Judah kings. So you have, when you start getting into 1st and 2nd Chronicles and 1st and 2nd Kings, it gets kind of confusing because you're seeing all these different kings at the same time. It is because you have two separate kingdoms. You got the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. You kind of following how this goes? You have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So then what happens is, it's probably my favorite part of all that is these northern kingdom. So there's different prophets, okay? You have northern kingdom prophets that are prophesizing to the northern kingdom of Israel that are saying, you need to turn, you need to change, God's going to take this away from you, God's going to destroy you. Northern kingdom prophets, okay? And then you have southern kingdom prophets. So it gets kind of confusing because you got northern kingdom kings and prophets, and you got southern kingdom kings and prophets, okay? And if you think about northern kingdom kings and prophets, probably the most famous northern kingdom prophets that you read about are Elisha and Elijah. Elisha and Elijah are northern kingdom prophets, and that's why I love them so much, because they were literally fighting a battle that was never going to be won. You know, I mean, these guys preach God and nobody listened. I mean, but that's who they were, you know. But then you had southern kingdom prophets. So most of the prophets, when we talk about prophets in the Bible, the books of prophets, okay, when you start talking about Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Lamentations and Isaiah, all your minor prophets, all those are southern kingdom guys, okay? Those are southern kingdom guys. Because the southern kingdom is going to endure. But the northern kingdom is going to get carried away. And that's why we call it the lost tribes of Israel. Okay, the northern kingdom, we call them the lost tribes because they got carried away and never came back. And that was by the Assyrians. So biblically, historically, what happens here is you have kingdoms upon kingdoms. And so the world goes from this, at the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all those guys, there's not really kingdoms. I mean, Egypt. But there's the rest of the country is like warlords, is what it is, you know. Essentially, Abraham's a warlord. I mean, if you want to get right down to it, that's what he is. Lot's a warlord. You know, there's no kingdom. They basically have a whole bunch of stuff, and they have a whole bunch of guys that fight their battles, and they actually are like their own little deal. He's a warlord, what we would call a warlord. He protects his flocks and territory and land by his own strength. He has mercenaries. He has guys that fight for him. He has paid military people on his payroll. He defends his own property. Abraham, all those guys did that. It's just how it was. They were nomadic. They traveled. and they protected their own boundaries. But when you start getting up into the days after David and Solomon, and when you start getting these other kingdoms that start to exert these power that mostly come out of the east. And these kingdoms, the first one of those in the Bible we really recognize is the Babylonian kingdom, the Babylonians, okay? But a little bit before that, we start talking about the Assyrians. And we don't talk a lot about them, but they're a really powerful group of people. And the Assyrians, they swoop down and they capture and destroy the northern kingdoms of Israel. The Assyrians do in 520 BC, 520 years before Jesus. The Assyrians swoop down and they take over these northern kingdoms. And the Assyrians were an assimilating nation. And what that means is that when they take over a country, they tried to assimilate those people into their culture. And so what happened was when they come in and take these northern kingdoms, these northern tribes, they carried them off, okay? It's kind of like, we'll talk about that in a minute, but they carried them off. All the ones that are worthwhile are the ones that they carried them off to their own land. And they give them different names, and they turned them into Assyrians. Well, the ones they didn't want, they left, okay? But they intermarried with them, and they gave them their gods, and those are the Samaritans. Okay? That's where we get our Samaritans. You see why the Jews hated the Samaritans? Because they're half-blood. They're half-breeds. They're not pure. They're half-breeds. So the Samaritans are these half-breeds. But Assyria didn't take Judah because God protected it. And not only that, Judah wasn't that desirable, you know, because Judah is rocky and it's hilly and it's not really good for farming or agriculture, and it's not fertile valleys like it was in the northern tribes. It wasn't real desirable. So nations didn't really want to risk a lot to get it because essentially they didn't really want it. Does that make any sense? So God protects that. Then the Babylonians come along, King Nebuchadnezzar, okay? And the Babylonian Empire, it becomes a real empire. And they take the Assyrians, they take all that, and it all becomes Babylon. And what happens is that Israel wants to survive, or Judah, you know, because now Israel's gone. So that's where it really gets confusing, right? Because it's not really Israel anymore. And even at the time of Jesus, it's like it's Israel. Well, yes and no, you know. I mean, it's Judah, right? You got to keep that in mind because Israel, the bulk of it's gone. The 10 tribes, they're gone. They're in Europe. They're in Asia. They're in Europe. They're in India, what we would call India today. They're carried off, okay? And they don't exist anymore. And so now Judah, God's protecting Judah, and you have this line of Judah kings. And probably the Babylonians are knocking at the door, the best way I know to tell you. The Babylonians are basically right at the door. And they're kind of telling Israel, this is kind of a paraphrase, there's a lot of history in here, but they're kind of telling Israel, they're saying, listen, boys, as long as you pay us and don't step out of line, we'll leave you be. We're going to leave you alone. So what happens is Israel starts to plunder the temple and plunder the gold of the temple and plunder the riches of Judah. We should say Judah. They start to plunder all their riches to pay the Babylonians off. So they won't destroy them because they can't defeat the Babylonians. It's not going to happen. But eventually, the Babylonians, of course, want more, and Judah doesn't want to give more. And so they come up to this breaking point. And the Babylonians, and so you get this king of Judah, and he basically says, okay, I'm not going to pay you no more. I'm not going to pay the Babylonians anymore. And you know the prophet Jeremiah, right? This is where Jeremiah comes on the scene. This is the days of Jeremiah. So Jeremiah comes along, and Jeremiah, he writes this big letter, and he says, listen, he said, pay the Babylonians, because this isn't going to end well for you if you don't do it. And so the king of Judah, he's got a bunch of other so-called prophets that are saying, oh, you can win. God's going to protect you. You can win. So the king of Judah takes poor old Jeremiah and throws him in these tunnels underneath Jerusalem and tears up the manuscript that Jeremiah wrote to give him. Eventually Jeremiah gets out, but the king of Judah's got this plan. See, he thinks that the king of Egypt is going to come in and swoop over there and help him, because he thinks Egypt would like to have Judah on Egypt's side. And he thinks that the king of Egypt's going to come in and save him from the Babylonians. So what happens is several things. The Babylonians actually come in and siege Jerusalem a couple of times before they actually siege it for good. And they plunder it, but they leave it intact. And the temple's still intact, the walls are still intact, it's still Jerusalem. But eventually, in about 486 BC, the Babylonians are going to siege Jerusalem for good. And when they would take cities back then, they would siege the city. The cities were walled. Jerusalem was in a mountainous, it was very hard to you couldn't just march into Jerusalem. Jerusalem had walls, and Jerusalem was in a rocky spot and mountains, and you couldn't just take Jerusalem. It wasn't possible. So what the Babylonians did is they built all around it, and they fortified it, and they sieged it. And they basically cut all the food and all the water, everything off. Nothing came in, nothing went out, until they starved the people to death. If you read the Bible, they were eating each other's babies, right? And they were eating dung that birds dropped. They were selling bird dung, because literally they were starving to death. There was nothing to eat. Eventually, then, Babylonians are going to destroy Jerusalem, and they're going to tear the temple to the ground. They're going to take all that stuff back to Babylon. Going to take all of it back, right? But God said, listen, God told Jeremiah, God said, Jeremiah, he says, this is what you need to tell him. He says, in about 71 years, I'm going to bring them back. Okay? So they got carried off to Babylon, and the Babylonians were like the Assyrians. The Babylonians were an assimilating culture. So what the Babylonians did is they carried everybody good off, right? And they left everybody they didn't want in there. These are the days of Daniel, okay? These are the days of Ezekiel. These are the days of Jeremiah, Isaiah. This huge bulk of the Old Testament revolves around the Babylonian captivity and the return from captivity. So when you see the Old Testament, you're like, oh, there's a whole lot there. Whole lot there. There is. But what you got to understand is the bulk of it, after you get through Judges, you get through 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and you go into poetry books. After the poetry books, the rest of the Old Testament pretty much exclusively is about Babylon. It's about the carrying off of Babylon, being in Babylon, and coming back from Babylon, and rebuilding the temple, and making Jerusalem back again. That's what the bulk of it is. So you can't read the Old Testament, oh, you get all this thousands of year history. You don't. You don't get that, okay? What you get is you get pockets of it. So Jeremiah, Ezekiel's a Babylonian prophet, okay? Isaiah is a prophet of captivity. Most of the minor prophets are prophets of captivity. Those guys, Ezekiel prophesied from Babylon. Daniel was in Babylon, right? And they gave him Babylonian names, and they fed him Babylonian food, and they tried to make them Babylonians because that's what the Babylonians did. They tried to assimilate them into their culture. But Jeremiah, Daniel says, boy, this is a lot to tell you, but I'm kind of giving you the overview. Daniel says, listen, Daniel says, I know from reading Jeremiah. Okay, so I got to back up a little. Okay, so the Babylonians, right? That's the beginning of Daniel. Babylonian captivity, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, those guys, that's all Babylon. But in the middle of Daniel, it changes. Xerxes, remember that? Remember Xerxes? Okay, Esther, remember Esther? Okay, it changes, right? But what happens is it's the Medes and the Persians, okay? And the Medes and the Persians are so powerful of an empire that when they come into Babylon, the Babylonians just open the gates. The Babylonians know they can't defeat the Medes and the Persians. So there's no war. There's no war. The Babylonians just give it to them. Babylonians open the gates of the city and say, just come on in, because we know that you're going to whoop us otherwise, and that's not going to happen. Remember that? And you remember the handwriting on the wall in Daniel? Remember? Where it says, this night your kingdom. Remember that? You remember the handwriting on the wall in the book of Daniel? And he sees the handwriting on the wall, Mede, Tinkin. He says, what does that mean? He says, tonight your kingdom will be taken away from you. Your kingdom won't stand. And then the Medes and the Persians come in, right? They were drinking chalices from the Lord that they'd taken from Israel, remember? And Daniel comes in and he says, this is what it means. You're going to lose your kingdom. And the Medes come in. But see, the Medes come in and take over. So the Medes are now in control, the Medes and the Persians. And they're very, very powerful. But the difference between the Medes and the Persians and the Babylonians is that the Medes and the Persians they're not an assimilating kingdom. So they don't want to make people Medes and Persians. They don't care anything about that. So when the Medes and Persians come in, they say, listen, if you want to go home, go home. We don't care. If you want to go back, go back. And Daniel says, oh, Jeremiah says in 71 years we're going to go back. So Daniel says, it's time to go back. We should be going back, right? Now, this is where you get Ezra and Nehemiah, okay? Ezra and Nehemiah, which in the Hebrew Bible is one book, but in our Bible is two books. Ezra and Nehemiah. So the Medes say, okay, go home. So Jerusalem's destroyed. The walls are torn down, the temple's gone. I mean, it's still there, but it's just ruins, right? Matter of fact, Lamentations was written from the grotto. Jeremiah wrote Lamentations from the grotto of Jerusalem, and Jeremiah will wind up dying in Egypt before Jerusalem is rebuilt. That's just a side story. But, so, what happens here, I lost my train. Okay, so what happens is that Daniel knows it's time to go back. So Ezra says, I'm going to go back, and I'm going to rebuild the temple. So he goes to King Xerxes, and he says, listen, I want to go back, and I want to rebuild the temple. And Xerxes says, okay, Nehemiah. He says, you can go, and not only can you go, but I'm going to give you all these articles of the temple, all this stuff that was hauled out of the temple by the Babylonians that's still sitting in a warehouse. I'm going to give you all that stuff to take back to rebuild the temple. And so Ezra goes, okay, great. So Ezra takes a bunch of guys and heads back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, right? But then Nehemiah comes along, and then Nehemiah says, oh, but guess what? There's no wall around Jerusalem. So if they rebuild the temple, them other nations are just going to come in, swoop in there, and destroy them. And so Ezra says, I want to go back and rebuild the wall. So Nehemiah is the cupbearer to the king, and Nehemiah comes in and says, listen, let me go back and let me rebuild the wall. And Xerxes says, okay, Nehemiah. He says, you go ahead and do that. So he gives him all these men. He gives them these permits. He gives them letters from the king that says he can do it. He gives them all this stuff. And so Nehemiah goes back and Ezra goes back, and they rebuild the wall and the temple of Jerusalem. That's Ezra and Nehemiah. And we're out of time as far as I can get. Let me write this down. I will bring it next Wednesday night. I just give you a little overview because I don't want you to be lost on where we're at here. I know there's a lot, and I know I gave you a lot tonight, but maybe in your mind it'll start to kind of I hope it starts to kind of make sense how all this works. Because there is a logic to it. You know what I'm saying? So now we're at Ezra and Nehemiah and Daniel, and then we'll talk about Esther. Got it. Okay.